Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I beg your attention kindly, we beg to start. Having a climate summit hosted by an African country comes at a very opportune and timely moment for us to share some of the lessons that we've learned as far as addressing climate change is concerned, and also showcase some of the studies that have been done on the African continent, looking at the impacts of climate change in the continent. Thank you for joining us and welcome for this side event. My name is Elizabeth Wanja. I work with the Kenya Climate Change Working Group, and we are having this side event in a partnership with CUCAFE, and we'll be focusing on just the role of climate finance in the just energy transition agenda. For a background, as you might all be aware, the impacts of climate change on the African continent cannot be ignored. The impacts of climate change are now more real and more severe and more frequent, and this has further been impounded by a couple of issues, including our geographical location, our dependent on very climate sensitive sectors, including agriculture, which is around 80% rain-fed in the region, among other factors, which again, with climate change, they are made more severe. And this has, over the years, contributed to increasing our vulnerability. And also looking at our coping mechanism, we don't have the capacities to cope with the impacts, be it in terms of finance, be it in terms of access to information, including the early warning systems. And 2015 marked a very key milestone in the history of climate change globally, having the ratification of the Paris Agreement. We saw most of the African countries were able to submit their NDCs, and a quick analysis on the updated NDCs, we realized that most of the African countries are making deliberate efforts to directly or indirectly focus on the just energy transition. We see a country like Nigeria have committed to accompany their NDC with the just transition policies. And I think this shows some political goodwill from the African countries, but this is very conditional in terms of support from the developed countries. And this is around climate finance, around capacity building, and also technologies. But even when you talk about the technologies, are these technologies the ones that we want as an African continent? Again, looking at the energy situation in the continent, energy is a key enabler for development. But as a continent, where are we in terms of our energy access? 80% of the continent still lacks access to electricity, be it in terms of lighting, be it in terms of cooking. And we all know the nexus, the benefits that access to clean energy brings about, looking at the nexus sectors, be it in terms of agriculture, be it in terms of education, the health sector. And all this, if you are not able to address or make energy affordable to our people, this will then lead to inequalities in terms of our progress and even our development as a continent. But on the far end, all is not lost. As a continent, I think we are not just at the receiving end in terms of the impacts of climate change, but we also have some solutions that you can bring on board if well supported to advance them to the next level. And these solutions are locally led solutions that as a continent we feel could work for us. And this provides a very good economic sense of bargaining power for Africa in terms of our rich resources when you look at the energy sector, so that we are able to transition to a low carbon development pathway. We don't have to engage in heavy carbon sectors. In terms of energy, we already have rich energy resources that are clean. It's only a matter of investing in them in a manner that makes sense to the African continent. And in all this, we need to ensure that there is inclusivity and there is local ownership in terms of driving this agenda. And with that background, I wish to introduce our panel for this conversation. And from my immediate right, we have We have Mwale. He works with COMESA, and he has previously engaged in a couple of programs across the region, and he's passionate about climate change, and he leads the climate change program at COMESA. Second to him, we have John Kioli, currently serving as the chair of Kenya Climate Change Working Group. He's also the CEO of Green Africa Foundation, and is passionate about climate change and has contributed greatly in terms of coordinating CSO's activities around policy advocacy, and also was very instrumental in the development of the National Climate Change Act of Kenya. And upon its enactment, he was appointed to the council that is chaired by the president. On my third, we have Madam Salome. Salome represents the First Lady. She's the Senior Chief of Staff in the Office of the First Lady. Thank you, Salome. And she also is also our chief guest for this event. We also have Dr. Amara. Amara is a strategist, a public policy expert, and a social impact profession on city and state policy. Currently, she serves as the president of Transnational Advocacy Organization, and she's also served as a manager of policy and research for the Movement of Black Lives and a strategy advisor for organizations and companies. She has a background in policy work. She has 2 undergraduate degrees, 2 master's degrees, and a PhD. And she will be sharing with us some perspectives around energy situation in the continent. Next to her is Dr. Alfonso Somorin. I think Somorin is not a new face in the global climate change agenda. When you talk matters finance, his name will definitely pop out. And Somorin works with the World Bank. He's a regional principal officer at the African Development Bank and leads the bank's work on climate change, green growth in around 13 countries in the East African region. And these include supporting countries in terms of accessing climate finance for implementation. He holds a PhD in international environmental policy, and he also has 2 master's degrees. And to my final speaker, we have a young lady, very passionate about gender issues. We know that you cannot have gender equity or address climate change in totality or energy insecurity without incorporating gender. Gender is very critical. We need to have gender-aware policies. We need to have gender-responsive technologies, and even the finance and the projects that we are implementing need to respond to the unique needs and priorities of men and women in the society. Her name is Abigail Kima, and she's the founder of Halihewa Podcast, which is a platform that showcases different stories from the African continent in terms of climate change and how the African people are coping with the adverse impacts of climate change. We are also joined by an online speaker, Madam Sheldon from Democratic Republic of Congo. Who will also be giving some interventions around issues of climate change in the basin. And with that introduction and background of our event today and our panelists, allow me to welcome our first speaker, John Kioli, who will start us off by painting sorry, I forgot to welcome our chief guest to make some quick remarks on behalf of the First Lady. You're most welcome.
Okay, can you hear me? Thank you, Elizabeth, for the warm welcome. distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed, good afternoon. My name is Nancy Salamba, and I am the Chief of Staff at the Office of the First Lady, and I am here to represent the First Lady of the Republic of Kenya. First and foremost, let me pass on her greetings and congratulations to all of you for these important deliberations here this afternoon, and also apologize on her behalf. She would have loved to be here in person, but could not make it due to unavoidable circumstances. But that said, we have a message from her, and that's what I'll be taking you through. So I take this opportunity to thank the Kenya Climate Change Working Group, Kenya Short-Lived Climate Pollutants, SLCP Project, and CUCAFE for organizing and inviting us to this important COP27 side event. Ladies and gentlemen, as we gather here today to deliberate on commitments towards raising ambitions towards a world that is resilient to climate impacts, we must take into consideration our different levels in terms of economic development, resource exploitation, and avenues to enhance the well-being of our communities. Global South countries face a unique challenge in assessing modern energy to fulfill her development needs, and to emphasize this, about 600 million Africans do not have access to electricity, although the continent is richly endowed with sufficient energy resources. Current demographic, urbanization, and economic growth trends will require us to boost our electricity generation and consumption, and this has important implications for our climate commitments. Africa is richly endowed, as I've said a short while back, in energy and mineral resources, and these are new market opportunities for us within the green transition. These opportunities could help the continent build a climate resilient and integrated sustainable energy sector. Nevertheless, our policies towards achieving climate resilience and a just energy transition must be tailored towards inclusivity, leaving no one behind. This transition requires close consideration of the equity implications and challenges associated with prevailing energy poverty, low energy consumption, and energy needs for economic growth and transformation. Our unique state of development witnesses daily growth in youth unemployment, which increases pressure on governance system and deepens poverty, and combined with increasing effects of climate change, impacts are making it difficult to move away from old models of energy production towards greener technologies. This places us at an exceptional position, and without necessary green climate finance that is urgent. Policymakers remain with very little alternatives to meet the myriad challenges I have mentioned above. We have to come to terms with the fact that the reorientation of education, training, both local and regional value chains necessary to ensure stable employment from green energy is not an easy fix. Renewable energy plants are high-tech and require little labor during operation. Most jobs are created during construction, and they are low to medium skilled and predominantly limited to the length of time it takes to build an installation, which is about 2 years on average. The challenge, therefore, especially for women, is for us to enable them to acquire the skills they need to be gainfully engaged in this green transition, and we need to come up with scalable programs and even finance those programs so that women can be able to be part of this green transition at all levels. We are motivated, therefore, to focus on opportunities to expand our markets, necessitating African countries to develop blueprints that offer a clear vision of the place of renewable energy in our energy systems to widen the market for investors, including strengthened mechanisms for pooling of power and make cross-border trade of locally manufactured parts and equipment accessible and affordable. Additionally, the challenge we face is that funding local industries at an early stage is a critical missing link in enabling meaningful domestic participation in the renewable energy sector. And our hope is that as part of these engagements and conversations you're having, solutions will be found and implemented to close these gaps. Before I conclude, you might wonder, so what is the Office of the First Lady doing here? The First Lady of the Republic of Kenya is a champion and an advocate for women economic empowerment, not just in Kenya, but in the region. And most of the women that we serve are in the agricultural sector. And what's happening right now is that because of climate change, she is not able to gain meaningful livelihood because the ground will just not produce what she needs to be able to take it to the market to trade and get an income that helps and supports her and her family. So what we are realizing is that even though we have a constituency of about 90 to 100,000 women that we work with under a program we call Joyful Women, which is a table banking project, which is ably run by my colleague Stella, if you can please stand up. Chepngeno, she's in charge of our Women Economic Program. We cannot be able to help them transit or even continue with their livelihood projects because climate challenges and impact are real. And so what we have done is come up with an additional pillar, a strategic pillar that we are calling Environment and Climate Action. And under Environment and Climate Action, we're looking at the green economy, we're looking at health and wellness, we're looking at the circular economy and the whole value chain, and also looking at clean cooking methodologies and smart technologies and new ways of viable ways of farming that do not necessarily include tilling the land. And part of, I'm here with one of our colleagues, Arnold Kipchumba, who is under our Environment and Climate Action Program, and they are driving that conversation, and not just conversation, but action on the ground to ensure that we educate, we inform, and empower our women in terms of the impact of climate change and work alongside them for them to come up with new ways and new technologies of being able to put food on the table. And like I say, things like clean cooking and the circular economy, better ways of farming is the things we are bringing to the table. So that's why we are here today as the Office of the First Lady, because we realize that the Economic Empowerment Program cannot go on unless we actually add our voice and make it known that we actually are concerned about climate issues and we need solutions for our women. So in conclusion, it is critical to ensure that matching the transition to just energy with broad-based development, which to a larger extent depends upon international finance support. This support will need to be substantial, putting in mind the facts behind hydrocarbons remaining the mainstay of many of Africa's biggest economies, of which transit must be appropriately financed and technically supported. And as you do this, please remember the woman is at the center of this whole conversation, and that women actually are the makers and the change agents and the transformative agents in the community. And if we impact one woman, we impact her family, the community, and in turn, the nation at large. So that is our humble request, that as you come up with these solutions, please ensure that they are gender sensitive, and they are backed by data, and they are fit for purpose, not just for our women, but also for the continent that we live in, which is Africa. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy, and kindly pass our appreciation and gratitude to the First Lady. As a country, I think we are very privileged to have a presidency that is very passionate about climate change, And thus, we are sure that we'll be able to make some progress in terms of addressing the issues that we are facing us as far as climate change is concerned. A round of applause to our speakers. And right, to kick us off, I wish to welcome John Kioli to kindly paint for us his perspective in terms of what just energy transition means for the African continent, and most importantly, some of the low-hanging fruits that we could consider in terms of transitioning in a dignified manner. You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Madam Nancy Salamba, who is the Chief of Staff in the office of the First Lady, we are grateful for coming here, and we are grateful for the commitment the office of the First Lady has towards climate change. I think the commitment is not even now, it goes in decades, from the involvement of women, empowering women in finance, because the women are where they are because they are not entrusted with money. And Joyo, which has been very, very concerned about empowering women and making them to come to the discussion of money, I think that's very useful. So please pass our regards to Her Excellency, and the commitment you have in this agenda is very useful. I want to also sincerely thank those who are here, CUCAFE, and also UNDP, FDB, and also COMESA, and other participants who have also come. Indeed, I know it's a conversation that is very key to all of us here. I sometimes wonder why we only depend on bankable projects. And this is where the conversation starts. It will be easy for World Bank and other bilateral banks to support a big project, say geothermal, say big solar wind power, say a big dam, because it's bankable. You can insure it. You can trust whoever you are trusting with the money. But that's not where the rubber meets the road, right? My grandmother down there may not ever be connected to that grid because she needs $15, $150 for connection, and father like $20 or $30 every month, and even the equipment to use the electricity might not be there. So what she needs is a solar lantern. Who funds solar lanterns? Nobody. So we end up in circles. We end up in other financial challenges which become a burden to women because they end up getting loans for solar lanterns which is worth like $20 and they end up paying $70. That's where the conversation is. We don't have money. We don't have people who believe in these projects that are unbankable. Can we have finance to go to unbankable projects? And this is a call I want to call all the financial sector. Can we package them in a way that they can be attractive so that we can reach out to women, we can reach out to those people who don't have money? The conversation goes deeper in terms of energy. More than 800 million of people in Sub-Saharan Africa do not have access to clean energy. What that means is that our sisters, our mothers, our grandmothers will continue having indoor air pollution because of the cook stoves they are using. They will continue suffering diseases because they do not know if there's any other option. Can we access even energy efficiency, not even renewable energy? Because 80% of our population in Africa are still using biomass energy. So we cannot do much about that. Can we make it efficient so that our people can reach clean energy and be able to get finance that is linked to that? This goes also to the agricultural sector. We know that so many sectors are depending on energy, especially agriculture, in terms of solarization of boreholes. We know that so many boreholes are stuck because they don't have fuel, they are stuck because the machines are broken down. So can we have systems that can use solar to now activate that? That needs money. If we go to the sector of health, and I'm concluding, Wanja, we find that health sector is depending heavily on energy. How many clinics have electricity? And when I'm talking about electricity, it's reliable electricity. Most of them are not under the grid. So again, clean energy avails itself as an option, whereby if we have off-grid energy projects within those areas, then those clinics can be able to refrigerate their vaccines. Our children can be able to get jabs. Our people during COVID can be able to get vaccines, and we can access health facilities anytime, 24 hours for emergencies. This cannot be done if these clinics do not have access to finance their energy needs. So this conversation goes between energy, technology must be engined, must be fueled by finance, which is reasonable and available. Thank you.
Thank you for the rich contributions. Our communities are not homogeneous. We have different, we have men and women, the young, the old, and whenever disasters or calamities strike, they are disproportionately impacted in terms of the impacts, and also their coping mechanisms also differ. So allow me to take us to the next speaker on our far right, Madam Kima, who will be sharing with us her experience on why gender justice is paramount for us, for the just energy transition to make sense in the African continent.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for the opportunity to be here and speak about gender justice. My name is Abigail Cherop Kiprono, and it's an honor to be here. So when you were speaking, you said three major things before you left the stage, and you talked about having women at the center, having it backed up by data and fit for purpose. So when you're having these conversations around energy transition, we have to remember that, as you said, women are at the center. So if you're going to think about just energy transition without inclusivity and proper participation of women, then we miss the point, and we risk creating solutions that may not be fit for purpose because the people who are supposed to be at the center of this transition are not involved. And then thinking about the climate crisis, as Elizabeth has said, women are already disproportionately affected by the impacts of climate change. And that comes in very many ways. When you look at migration, when people are supposed to move from one place to another because their homes have become unlivable, the people who are more vulnerable are definitely women and children. And then when we also look at, I'd say I do my activism or my advocacy with storytelling, and so I'll make references to a lot of the conversations I've had with women across Africa, and having visited the western part of Kenya and having conversations with them and seeing just how much the impacts of climate change are quite cross-sectional in their lives. I don't think any of us has ever thought about gender-based violence when it comes to the impacts of climate change. And so I was having a conversation with some of those women, and they talked about how during periods of drought, they're not able to wash the clothes in the house, they're not able to keep the houses clean. And so there's a lot of conflict that comes out of it. And at the end of the day, it is women that are blamed because of the societal expectations of what their roles are. And when you think about women, again, we look at their limited access and ownership to resources. And having conversation with these same women who mostly practice agriculture, they said their life would be much, much better if they were in a position to have access to things like land, where they're able to own land, they're able to take control of the activities that they carry out within their homes. And we are always talking about gender inclusivity and people-centered just energy transition. And in this sense, it's always seen as a lighting issue, but it goes beyond lighting, it goes beyond electrification. We have to look at the cooking, we have to look at the heating issue. And I say for sure that you only act from a point of information. If you're not informed, it means you're not able to receive whatever it is that is being offered. So if we look at just energy transition without putting women at the center, then it means when we are moving, we'll be leaving them behind. And I think the conversation is around leaving no one behind. And I'll echo what Mr. Kioli has talked about when it comes to our grandmothers. I mean, we all come from rural areas, or at least I come from a rural area. And I know going to my grandmother right now and speaking to her about solar is out of the picture. I know she is used to going to the forest, because we live close to a forest, to get firewood, and that's how she lives her life. And so when you're having these conversations without having them at the center, then they don't understand how they're supposed to receive this new technology. That is why it's important for them to be part of these conversations. And another barrier that still exists is, as women, we still keep shouting and asking to be heard. We are still asking for spaces where decision making happens. So with all these barriers that already exist, I don't see how we are able to move to a low carbon or a more sustainable way of a more sustainable energy pathway without women being in the conversation. And then another issue that I wanted to raise when it comes to energy transition is the fact that we use a top-bottom approach, where it's like we go into communities and then we just want to bring new technologies to them, but we forget that there is something that already existed within these communities or a group of women. There is a way in which they used to do their things, and I think it's a better way to actually build on the systems that already exist instead of coming up with completely new technologies without having consulted them, without understanding what their needs are. And then in terms of just energy transition in Africa, I feel that it's a very nuanced topic, because Africa has very different needs. It's not a one shoe fits all. We are so different, our cultures are different. The energy mix in Kenya is very different from the energy mix in Africa. So we really need to look at to look at it from a perspective of country-based context. We have to look at the specific needs that different women from Africa want. So without having all these things put together, then I don't think the conversation around just energy transition will get anywhere. Without having these conversations, without making it a people-centered conversation, and without making it centered on women, because like we have said, they're at the heart of just energy transition. So thank you.
Thanks, Abigail, for bringing out the intersectionalities between gender and climate change. And to our next speaker, our colleague from COMESA, we know that combined with poor governance, the climate change presents one of the largest and most global environmental variable contributing to peace and security in the continent. And we all know that issues of food security, issues of access to clean water, affordability in terms of energy access, is of importance to COMESA, and it's of priority to COMESA as well. So why, kindly just inform this meeting what COMESA is doing in terms of ensuring that we have sustainable infrastructure in terms of energy, food, and water.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for the floor. First of all, I wish to recognize the presence of Madam Nancy from the Office of the First Lady of Kenya. We really appreciate your presence, and it's a pleasure to be with you here. As you may be aware, COMESA started as a trade institution, basically to promote regional integration and also promoting the movement of goods and services as well as people in the region. But over the years, we've realized the complexity of trade, realizing that we need not only significant investments, but also policy harmonization. There is need actually to ensure that Africa is ready in terms of infrastructure-wise, but also the policies as well as the laws that are in place. So where energy is concerned, Elizabeth, I would say that according to what Madam Nancy told us, Africa is faced with a great energy poverty. Actually, a recent report revealed that Africa needs about 700 terawatt in hours of energy. Now, of that, South Africa and the Northern African countries, they need about 70% of that. Now, Africa has got great appetite for socio-economic development. But when you look at the tenets, or actually the bedrock or the backbone of development, you discover that energy is at the center of development. Now, with the energy poverty at play, we are unable to fully develop as Africa and as COMESA as a region. For instance, let me zero in on trade. The trend in trade between COMESA region or Africa at large with the rest of the world is that Africa trades in raw materials. Now, for COMESA region or Africa at large to derive the great economic benefit out of trade, we need to trade in finished products and not raw materials only. But for us to transform those raw materials into finished goods, we need to establish the industries, the factories, but we were unable to establish those because of the great energy poverty that we have. So indeed, at the center of a just energy transition for Africa, for the COMESA region, we need things like policy, harmonization, and refinement. We need significant investments in energy transition, echoing the words of my colleague there who said, no one has to be left behind. Most of the energy that we have is affected by climate change because most of it is hydroelectric as well as solar. But when you look at climate change, it's having a significant impact on the hydroelectric energy that we have. So indeed, it's a call to our African leaders, the technocrats, and many other players in the field to ensure that the policies respond to the just energy transition needs, but also significant investments are done to ensure that Africa gets the energy that it needs for it to achieve socio-economic development. Thank you.
Sorry, a round of applause to Lwembe. Dr. Amara, we are in the last decade of action as far as the SDGs are concerned. And looking at the latest SDGs progress report, we are not on track in terms of energy status in the, of the continent. What are some of the policy interventions or measures that could be put into consideration to ensure that we are able to transition or to midwife this process for the continent?
Thank you so much for that question and also for the comments and the recommendations that have been put forth by my colleagues on this panel, many of which I won't repeat because I think that they have really covered a lot of ground in terms of how we actually make progress on the SDGs. And so we often have in the UN spaces commitments, we have goals, we have aspirations, but where we struggle is in implementation and the actualization of those goals, commitments, and aspirations. And so the first recommendation that has really been part and parcel of many of the conversations, even for the last couple of weeks here at COP, is, for example, when we talk about investments, this is a word that has come up many times, whether in consideration of some of the climate adaptation measures that are needed, or loss and damage, or empowering different communities. The notion of transparency and accountability measures to actually ensure that the investments that are made reach the communities that are most in need. Oftentimes when we have financing mechanisms, they may be routed through central governments or through other institutions who may not be as closely connected to the needs of those who are on the ground experiencing the negative impacts of the climate crisis. And so as we are pushing for additional investments, that push and for additional financing mechanisms, the push must include considerations for transparency so that there's an openness about how those funds are allocated, how resources are allocated, making sure that it is not simply in the form of debt financing, which we know can actually further entangle communities that are already struggling economically, and also ensuring that the money, the resources, the funding is reaching the communities that are most in need. That must also come with proclamations around capacity building and what it looks like to make sure that communities as a whole are benefiting. So we talked about, I think some of my colleagues talked about the need for upskilling. How do we make sure that communities have the skills necessary for the technologies that will be made available? It doesn't start when people are in adulthood or in middle age or elders. It starts when they're in elementary school, through what they're studying. It starts through education, through exposure to the kinds of fields and skills that will equip them so that when they leave school, they can go directly into the economy and plug in at those points where there are opportunities. So we have to have a simultaneous education strategy that will ensure that future populations, not just in the present, will actually come up learning the skills that will make them equipped to be able to take advantage of any technologies that are available in the so-called green economy. The other component is making sure that when it comes to the economic impacts, I think it was the Chief of Staff who mentioned how some of the jobs that are available are quite temporary, 2 years. We see a lot of that, I've seen that in a lot of my economic work, even in the US. The construction jobs are there, but once the building has been constructed, the job goes away. So we have to look more holistically at what we mean when we say jobs. It's beyond just the construction. It includes services, the accountants, the attorneys, the food delivery companies, all of those auxiliary industries that go along with development. We actually have to pay attention to that as well, because those are the kinds of interventions that can maximize the impact of a just transition. We're not looking to simply transition into a future state that just resembles the current state with a little less of the emergencies that we're seeing on the day-to-day. We are transitioning into a position of thriving. That's our aim, not maintaining the status quo. And also to avoid making the mistakes that we have seen in the West. So this notion of just mimicking what's coming out of the West, or that we have to sort of copy, is actually not aligned with the ingenuity that exists in the rural areas in Kenya, in Nigeria, elsewhere around the continent. So from a financing perspective, making sure that financing mechanisms are tailored to that ingenuity, it means being willing to take the so-called risky investment. That we can't just bank on the kinds of innovations that are a guaranteed win, because that's actually not what innovation looks like. Innovation requires the ability, the space to make mistakes, the space to fail even, the space to experiment. And we've seen, at least I've seen in some of the villages where I'm from, ingenuity that would far surpass even folks who this is what they do for a living. So the question and the challenge for us is, how do we find where those innovations are happening, where that creativity is being displayed, and support it and invest in it and give them the space to grow, to experiment, because that is how we will ensure that we move into technology that is accessible, because nothing is revolutionary if it is not broadly accessible. And the last point is that a just transition is not just if it harms the lives and livelihoods of any people. And on that, we have to consider how our indigenous family are experiencing the climate crisis, how those who are living in rural areas are experiencing the marginalization or the exclusion, not being able to take advantage of any advancements in society. If our so-called transition simply means that those who are in cities are doing better, or that our GDP has expanded while indigenous communities are struggling, or they're not seeing the improvement in quality of life, then we've simply made a transition, but it hasn't been just. And so for every recommendation, keeping that as a baseline to ensure that all of our communities are able to advance is something that I think is very important. Thank you.
Some rich contributions there. So I think it's a matter of pausing and reflecting. What do we need to do differently so that we're able to realize the SDG 7 target? Looking at the targets that we have, we know that COVID negatively impacted the progress that we'd made in terms of SDG 7. What do we need to do differently so that we're able to make some progress? And while we are doing this, we also look at it from a human rights perspective. Even the projects that we are bringing about in our efforts to transition, are they affecting the rights of the people, especially the most vulnerable? And to our final speaker, for the physical speakers, we all appreciate that the financial sector is very instrumental in enabling this transition. And this is because it can provide the capital that is required for this, and also providing the efficient risk-sharing mechanisms for this transition, and thus integrating just energy transition logic in the financial operations is very key to ensure that whatever projects or interventions are being proposed don't end up infringing on the rights of the people. As you might also be aware, the World Bank in 2013 launched a strategic plan that is dubbed Center of Africa Strategy, and it's looking at transforming Africa. And one of the priority areas that the bank is looking at is powering Africa under one of the big fives. So, Maureen, being in the last year of implementation of this strategic plan, what do you think the bank has done in terms of the milestones? And most importantly, what are some of the focus areas or interventions that you are looking forward to consider in the next phase of implementation?
Thank you, Elizabeth. Good afternoon, everyone. The advantage of being the last speaker is that you can say you agree. And I absolutely agree with all the beautiful and very spot-on points that have been raised today. Thank you, every one of you. Elizabeth, let me correct something. I kept on hearing World Bank. This is African Development Bank, okay? So, and I think it's very important to emphasize that identity of the bank in responding to the African situation or African development challenge. And I'm going to speak about the identity of the bank on the one hand, but also as a bank that is part of a group of banks, multilateral development banks. But for a moment, I want us to pause and just reflect on one thing. When we use the word transition, forgive me if I'm not very good with English, it gives a sense that you're moving from one thing to another. Is that correct? Is this transition when you're starting from zero? I mean, what do you, because in the way we talked about it is usually if you're probably moving from one color to another, if you're moving from brown to green, or if you're moving from one level to another. But when you're talking about countries that are dealing with energy poverty, I think the conversation about transition should be very much different. And that is the starting point. First and foremost, it means different things to different people. And you cannot compare transition in Kenya, in a country where 93% of the current stored energy source is from renewable energy, to a country like South Africa that is heavily based on coal. So it's very important to understand that the transition pathway is very unique and very different in every country. And that context specificity is very important because then you have the ability to design that pathway the way that is best fit for purpose. And I like a lot of the keywords that we hear in here. And then the second thing about just transition, what is it? What does it mean again? Look, it is not the goal. It's a framework for us to achieve development in Africa or in a country with this deep connection to the people, with a deep consideration to the people who are going to be the beneficiaries of this investment. So it's very important to understand that if it happens outside the people, then it may not be just. And I think I want to really echo that. And that means that there has to be an ownership of that transition by the people who want it, not the people who are, in quote, going to finance it. And that is the basis of the African partnership, because then with the bank, with the African Development Bank, our starting point is to understand what is the just transition pathway, what is the just transition framework in a country, because that's what we want to do. We want to engage in a country based on the goals and the standards you have set for yourself. And I think I want you to understand that we would definitely come in with the scale of financing that you may need, running into billions of dollars. And the bank has the capacity to do that. But I don't even want to focus on the money part. I want to focus on the fact that these finance flows within a context of strategic partnership. And I think it's very important to understand that anything outside that partnership, you may not get the scale of financing that you need. And if at all, it may not be very targeted to the goal that you want to achieve. So it's very important that the starting point is to define that partnership that we need. And that partnership could be between the African Development Bank and the government of Kenya, or African Development Bank and Malawi, and be able to say, this is the goal that we want, and this is the cost, and this is the value of this. How do we then begin to mobilize? And I think it's very important. And what happens within the context of that partnership is to understand that there's a whole range of investment, or there's a whole range of engagements that need to happen that will trigger that financial flows. And I call it financial ecosystems. We hear things like we don't have bankable projects. There's a whole skill set involved in designing that. We hear things like that we don't have enough private capital investment in energy, or the money is not trickling down. Those are questions that require that you develop an ecosystem that's able to respond to that. And an example is to just appreciate what could happen in a country if the government would decide to have a policy incentive to say we give a tax waiver for any renewable energy investment. Or if you or the financial system of a country deciding that if you are able to show that your investments are very much at the local level, and you are able to show the result that impacts more on women, you will get a financing that is priced differently from others. Do you understand what I'm saying? These are some of those ecosystem incentive structures that are important to be in place, because then once you put them in place, then you're very sure that resources can flow, either from MDBs, but even within. I'm going to keep saying this. We have a lot of capital in Africa. They are largely dormant. And we need to turn a lot of this dormant capital in our pension funds, in some of our table banking circles, to productive assets, productive capital where we can use to put investment and drive innovation. And I want to emphasize something when we hear innovation, because it almost becomes like a common everything that everybody talks about. We need innovations that are market creating. And they're really innovations that don't require rocket science. Innovations that the grandmother can be part of, and that can create an opportunity to move from one customer to 3 customers. Innovations that can lead into aggregation, and that aggregation can bring us into bigger market spaces. And I think this is something that we have seen that are possible on the ground. And what the bank does is to be able to in place to be able to support that at different levels. So whether through our grant capital, whether through our concessional loans, we're able to support some of these innovations, market-creating innovations in the long run. I'll be very bold to say that, especially in Kenya, sometimes when it comes to investment in renewable energy, the phase of investment that is very perceived to be risky. It could be drilling, it could be exploration, for instance, for geothermal. And so it requires MDB to be able to come in with a lending that's giving you a tenure of about 30 years, with up to 5 years grace period. And basically, when you think about net present value of money, what you have right now at a very concessional time and to pay back over 30 years is almost nothing. But then that helps you to be able to take the risk in the upfront investment required. And by the time you're able to generate the steam, and I'm using the example of geothermal, then the private sector is able to come in and you're turning the steam into energy. And by doing that, we're able to make sure that the pricing is fair, but also we're also able to invest in things such as transmission and connectivity. Look, I'm going to be very honest with you. There are things that are not every investment is very attractive to the private sector. We have to be very honest about that. And what you have to do is to find a financier that is able to take on those investments. They may not be very attractive, but they have a power to trigger investment by the private sector should they be in place. And that is what MDBs have been able to do. On the very last point, it's also very important to understand that the challenges that we're trying to solve are solvable. And I think it's a mindset to be able to accept that they are solvable, but we must not take away the leadership that is required to channel every resource, every partnership in the right direction. It's one thing to have money on the table. It's one thing to have partners around the table ready to work. It's another thing completely to have all of those resources channeled in the right direction. And I think it's very important, Elizabeth, that we keep emphasizing that there's a place of that leadership that tells us this is the way we want to go. Because if you don't follow the right way, even speed doesn't matter. Speed doesn't matter in a wrong direction. A good vehicle doesn't matter if you're following the wrong direction. A good road doesn't matter if you're following the wrong direction. Get the right direction is very critical, and that is what the bank tries to do with the countries to be able to make sure that everyone who comes along is following along in the right direction. Thank you very much.
Wow, aren't we lucky as a country and privileged to have an African working for a multilateral development bank and based in Kenya? We are lucky, right? Thank you for that. I think the bank has made deliberate efforts to ensure that whatever interventions they are implementing in the different countries they operate are locally led. And this has been seen through the country strategy papers. I think the development of these strategy papers and even the reviews are usually very participatory, and I think this is one of the avenues that we could use as stakeholders in the energy and climate change space to ensure that these papers speak to the priorities that we have in our respective countries. And I think the bank has also established a forum for CSOs, which convenes every year, whereby CSOs are able to have a dialogue with the bank and communicate or pass this information in terms of what we feel should be prioritized by the bank being the implementers on the ground. I think that brings us to the end of the first round, and we could quickly open the plenary for any quick clarifications and contributions. Any requests for the floor? Okay.
My name is Mercy from Kenya. My name is Mercy from Kenya, from the subnational government. And first I want to appreciate the role that ADB is doing in this forum, and you have come out very clearly on critical issues on transition. You've also promised to embrace adaptation finance. You've also promised to embrace loss damage and local land initiative. So for that case, we are really calling also to reconsider your approaches, and especially to the local or the lower government, if you really want to reach down, because you have said one point, it is one way to have the funding, it's another way to know where it hits most. And especially with the expansion of the intermediary cities, which are really becoming the first line of climate crisis. If we don't hit it right there down, we are likely to hit it the wrong direction. So as you move, please do not forget to go right down. And African nations, and especially Kenya, is doing very well in terms of the intermediary and the lower local government. So as you do your partnerships, consider partnerships with the national governments and also partnerships with the lower government, that is the county government, that can also address the intermediary crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Benson Ocheng. I'm a lawyer, but I specialize in climate finance law. And mine is to Fonso from FDB. Just to understand how different you are, for example, from one of these most hyped, but really very technical funding, the GCF. I've had the privilege to assist one of the only accredited banks in Kenya to get accreditation. I know that the process took about 3.5 to 4 years. If you want to invest in, say, energy projects for energy transition and things like that, that is such a long period. I don't know how quick FDB funding and those other considerations are vis-a-vis the kind of other funds or multilateral funds that we could be looking for investment in these kind of projects? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm Raymond from Uganda, and thank you for the forum. A question to Dr. Somorin. We thank FDB for the great work, especially as Elizabeth mentioned, having civil society in the agenda. I think that's remarkable for us. Ensure that civil society play a role in the FDB agenda and working together. My concern is especially on energy access. We know that promoting community resilience, especially access to affordable energy, is very important to ensure that we achieve the energy for all agenda for 2030. Our question is in relation to how do you scale resources to reach the communities, especially working with the civil society? What is your agenda in relation to ensuring that there is resilience and equitable access to energy by the local communities, and especially going to COP28, where we know that it's an agenda that we're going to look at strengthening community resilience. Question is also to a colleague, the lady in the middle, who talked about how they are doing communities. What are you doing to ensure that you promote empowerment of women, especially to ensure that they are empowered ensure to overcome the challenges, especially with climate action, and ensuring that they are held bearers accountable? How are you empowering the women, especially, so that they're efficient and they can support communities? Thank you.
Sorry, I think we can take the first round. The speakers could maybe quickly clarify and respond to the first round, then we do a second one. And I think most of the queries went to Dr. Somorin. Money matters.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone. And this is a reason why we are having this conversation, as opposed to us talking and just you listening. No, I think it's important to emphasize that. Let me clarify something. I think the questions around the difference between AFDB and GCF. GCF is an external facility under the UNFCCC with a mandate around adaptation, mitigation, and probably other issues around the conventions. And the way we see it, considered it to be a climate fund. It's a facility within the COP and the UNFCCC. It's important to understand that when we use the word climate finance, it's way bigger than just writing proposals to GCF. And this is something we're beginning to tell a lot of people. The world of finance is so huge and so diverse beyond just writing proposal. I'm not sure how many of you know the number of countries that are members of GCF. And in the 11 years, maybe 10 years of GCF's operation, it's probably approved only $11 billion. I always remember the number. In 10 years, approved $11 billion. So on average, about $1 billion every year. All the MDBs together approve nothing less than $60 billion every year. The least of them approve more, gives more. When I mean $60 billion of climate finance, not the entire development finance, because it's a portion of the entire development finance going to activities. I'm trying to clarify something, because we're not, GCF is good, Jeff, we need them, but they can't solve the scale of the challenge we're talking about. And unfortunately, you've alluded to also the complexity of access, especially for many African countries. So what we consider that's very important is to think out of the box, but also to find a space to blend resources together. There's something the government can finance. It could even be 10% of the total project cost. There's something the MDB can finance. There's something the private capital can come in to do. And you blend that together, as opposed to writing a proposal for 100% financing to GCF. It's not that heavily capitalized, and its operational framework makes it really hard. You know, how do you justify, a situation where you are told to show data of 30 years of rainfall differences to make climate rationale in a GCF proposal when you don't have a weather station, and your proposal is to request for money to build weather stations. Do you understand? You're required to show data of 30 years as a climate rationale, whereas the proposal is that you need data going forward. And those are some of those special needs and circumstances in the African context. Unfortunately, GCF is not tailored to address all of those concerns. So it means that whatever resources that we get there, we can use those resources to leverage additional resources from other places, either from the MDBs, the World Bank, African Development Bank, even European Investment Bank and the rest, but also to look at government resources. And I have to be honest with you, a lot of resources from the government, but also to look at the private capital in the country. So I need to be very careful here. I'm not against GCF. We are an accredited entity of the GCF, and our job is to help countries to be able to access that. But don't limit your source of climate funds to GCF. You may be missing out on other opportunities. Subnational flows, it's very important. But even when we design projects at national level, implementation happens at subnational level. Implementations happen at the local level. And what we're beginning to do at the bank now is to build the capacities of some of our beneficiaries in order to be part of the implementation framework of the project. So when you build a road, and I can give you an example, the road from Eldoret all the way to Kitale, Endebe, Swam, it's a road which is an improvement for those of you in Kenya. But the whole tree planting that happened along that into all of the degraded forests along the road was actually done by local young entrepreneurs. So even the Chinese may have built the road as contractors, but they were not. We were very clear in AFDB to say, look, some of these activities must go to local young entrepreneurs. And I think it's very important to do that as well. It's the same with water investment, it's the same in agriculture, irrigation. So we must also begin to see in our design. The end of it, and I'm hoping I'm going to keep quiet here, is look, whatever anyone is going to do in a country is largely determined by the framework in place. If it's strong, people will adhere to it. If it's weak, people will take advantage of it. And that is why it's very important to push for very strong leadership in our countries. And that's a role that the bank tends to really support. Thank you. Such a mouthful.
So I wanted to ask about just clarifying that second question. I know it was about local communities and accountability, but I want to make sure that I'm answering the right question.
I think the question was on women empowerment and what you're doing to empower the women to be able to engage.
So yes, thank you. Thank you for that, thank you. So on the question of women empowerment, I mean, I think, a lot of that has been shared with the other panelists. One of the key points, though, that I think was just made by my colleague is about the impact of subnational financial flows. So here in these spaces, we're often talking at the national level. I know when we talk about some of the broader frameworks, the AFCFTA and so forth, it can seem very, very high level, but most of the people that we engage are in their local communities. They're not coming to COP. They're not, in many instances, going to MDBs. They may be just doing very local they may need very local financial instruments. And so there's a model that is already in development through a format of community development financial institutions, which were created to fill in the gaps that larger banks simply were not able to, or in some instances unwilling to address. And so these community development financial institutions, or CDFIs, are the ones that are most closely connected to the people who are doing the work. They are willing to take higher risk in their loans and in their products because they have a mission that is about that local development. And so this is a space that has been very impactful for women in particular, but also for entrepreneurs and those who don't have 30 years of financial records to present in order to be seen as less risky than someone who has all of that sort of documentation. And so there's the important conversations and work that is happening at the national level, the international level, but the impacts are really felt at the local level. So while we are pushing for those local financial institutions to be aligned with some of the conversations that are happening here, it's also our responsibility to make sure that those communities are educated and given the information so that they can make the decisions that most suit their needs. Because we know that what is suitable for a farmer or someone who is in agriculture will not be the same as someone who is working in the electricity space as an innovator or someone who has another type of business, right? And so those differences require us to make sure that they are simply armed with information so that they can access the resources that may be available, but also so that they can hold leadership accountable. We cannot have a disconnect between the conversations that are happening in national government and then what's happening at local government. So part of our responsibility is to connect those dots. There has to be alignment, there has to be complete vertical alignment so that those of us who require resources or need support or are looking to find our own pathways have the right information that's necessary and tailored to allow us to accomplish the goals that we've set. There are many layers to it, but it is our responsibility if we want to make sure that these aren't just conversations that happen in large international spaces with very little impact on the ground.
Thank you, Dr. Amara. I think in the interest of time, we will not be able to take another round of questions, but this conversation is not ending here. Feel free to engage with the speakers in your bilaterals. And at this juncture, I wish to again give the speakers each a minute or less to give us their final words. And while at that, I would request maybe when it comes to John's time, you could also share with us the role of the intermediary governments, an approach that we are taking for Kenya in terms of integrated energy planning. And also for the rest, in COP26, countries in the global south, in the global north, signed the Just Transition Declaration, whereby they promised to fund climate actions and decarbonization in the global south. In your opinion, what is the progress and what needs to be done differently? Maybe we could start with, again, Mr. Lwembe.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I think I would like to say that a just energy transition cannot happen overnight. And so for African countries, I think planning is imperative to ensure that a just energy transition happens with nobody being left behind. When you talk about progress since Glasgow, not much has been done. For instance, just for the sake of interest of the delegates here or the participants, South Africa alone needs about $89 billion for a just transition to take place. Now, when you compare to other countries, as already mentioned by my colleagues here, national circumstances differ. And so the planning process now has to happen at national level. What are the national circumstances? What are the priorities? So that a planning can be done not only at policy level, but also looking at the financial investments that are required to ensure that a just transition addresses the needs at national level. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, facilitator. I want to use half a minute, and I donate 1 minute to Mary. Mary will take the same bus to my village, and she might be paying my bus fare next time, so I want to donate half a minute. But going back to the conversation, I want to say that as a country, we have decided to have one omnibus managing issues of climate change, and that's the Climate Change Act of 2016, whereby we have the sectorial ministries, Ministry of Planning, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Environment, and then the Council of Governors also are sitting there. I want to speak to Mercy, who asked a question, that omnibus is supposed to inform the county government in terms of what is happening at the national level, international and regional. Because how will my person at the ground ever know that COP27 happened, There must be that link, and that link is encapsulated in law or in a policy. So what I want to say in other countries as well, if you can have one omnibus that carries everybody, that you can get everything. You can see from the national to the county level, then that carries all the problems you have. And also, make sure that you have that linkage in terms of an action plan or something, because policies are put in cabinets, we know that. But if you have an action plan that by this time we want this, by this time this thing will go to parliament for review, by this time if it doesn't go to review, we'll ask so and so. So if we have that kind of a thing, then we will know there is a duty bearer who is supposed to be answerable. So yeah, can I donate half a minute with your permission, facilitator, to Mary? She had a burning question.
Very quickly, kindly. Fixing it, we could go to Dr. Amara.
I think I just want to first thank the panelists and for all of their brilliance and knowledge that's been shared in this space, and just encourage people to, you know, what's important is not necessarily just while we're here, but to the communities that we go back to the cities, the counties, the states that we go back to, and to always have in the back of our minds how we make the conversations here actionable, and also how we hold people accountable, especially leadership accountable to the commitments that are made. I think that's a theme that we have to keep driving home, so that next year at COP28, we're not having the exact same conversation. We can actually see some of the progress that's been made on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to say it's been a great honor to be part of this conversation. Mine is rather more of a call for action, but also to make a promise. Look, the African Development Bank is your bank, and we're going to follow the direction that you take. So I want to really encourage for strong leadership and very clear policy direction about where we're going in every African country. Once we have that, and we build a strategy, but also the partnership we need within that context of the direction, and the bank remains available to use its convening power to bring the right actors around the table and be able to mobilize all the necessary financial and non-financial support that we need going forward. We must not miss this opportunity. I want to emphasize that. We've missed a lot of things in the past. We've missed out on a lot of things, too many things in the past. Well, as we try not to miss out, but we must also own it. And that's something that I'm looking forward to. And in our capacity, we'll remain available to work with you all. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity to be on this panel. And I want to appreciate the very insightful comments from the panelists on this event. And as I wrap up, what I'd like to say is, as we move forward, let's really interrogate what just energy transition means for Africa. And I think the definition of what just energy transition means is in the word just. So what is just? What is justice? What does that mean for communities? What does that mean for women? What does that mean for Africa that is on the path to development? And also, let us really consider the nuances that already exist and focus on country-specific needs and contexts to ensure that as we move forward, we are not leaving anyone behind. Thank you.
A final round of applause to our speakers. In less than a minute.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much, moderator, for allowing that half-minute donation through Mr. Kioli. My name is Mary Malu. I work with Kenya Electricity Generating Company, KenGen. I'm proud to be working for this company that is leading Kenya in renewable energy. Yeah, going straight to my question, and I don't want to leave this room with a confusion in my head. to Mr. Kioli, you said there's a problem in funding the projects that are seen as social projects that are not bankable. And from the same panel, I've heard Dr. Somorin, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, saying there's funding available, and the funding can be structured in a way that it can be blended to have all components in. There can also be structuring of the projects, categorizing of the projects in those that can be financed by private sector, those can be financed by the government, and all those solutions. So where is the gap between what you've said and what Mr. Kioli has told us? Where are projects falling within the cracks? And as we leave this room, how can we fix that? Yeah, thank you.
In the interest of time, I will not allow Dr. Somorin to respond to that. Maybe you can have a bilateral with him. And now I will turn it over to Amin for 1 minute to give the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Elizabeth. All protocols observed. On behalf of the Kenya Climate Change Working Group and our partners, it gives me pleasure to give the vote of thanks on the completion of this side event. The topic, Green Climate Finance at the Center of Just Energy Transition, Perspectives from the Global South. I think it was extremely inspirational, and I would like us to give a big hand to all our speakers, please. Wonderful. First and foremost, we sincerely thank Her Excellency, Ms.Rachael Ruto, for her opening remarks, ably presented and given by Nancy Salamba, our Chief of Staff. Thank you so much, Nancy. Please convey our gratitude to the First Lady with a promise that the Kenya Climate Change Working Group intend to meet her when back in Nairobi to personally give her the report of this session and the way forward for the women constituency that she has embraced to enhance synergy. Asante sana. You had mentioned about greener technologies will require finance, and definitely we should move in that direction. Dr. Alfonso Somorin, the Regional Principal Officer, Climate Change, African Development Bank. Again, asante sana to you. You have told us to get the right direction, and we have to move in that direction, inshallah. Mr. Lwembe, Mwale, COMESA, let's come out of the energy poverty. Thank you for your brilliant address. And Dr. Amara, Enya from CUCAFE, I think it was very impressive. You talked about the transition to make sure there's transparency, and we talked about just transitioning and making sure it happens. Thank you. John Kioli, our chairman. First of all, congratulations once again as being a member of the National Climate Change Council, and we thank you for your for whatever you've talked about. And I think he mentioned very, very well about my grandmother. I heard my grandmother so many times. And I think one thing we're hearing about the youth and women, and I would like to give another thematic to this scope also, care for the elderly. We need to bring that about because our elderly are really suffering in the climate change context. Eddie Gale, Kima, from Harley Heva podcast, let's put women in the center. Brilliant. With that, I would like to thank our mentor, our moderator, Elizabeth Wanja. Thank you, and well done for really doing the moderation so well. This event would not have been possible without the support of the Government of Kenya, Africa SLCP Project, and who are our co-organizers, and also the Marathon Climatique. Thank you for your support, and UNESCO Club of Women and Child Action Center. Thank you, UNFCCC Secretariat, for the efficiency in the context of the room allocation and for managing the transmission and the translations. Thank you so much. Thank you, Kenya Climate Change Secretariat, and all of you for attending this session. And we wish you well, and we hope and pray that you will achieve your objectives at the COP27 and work in the climate change space. Thank you all for being here, and the session is now closed.